The auctioneer almost skipped the final lot. He looked down at the paperwork, then back at the nearly empty sale ring. Lot 118. He paused. 13 Pine Ridge Heritage cattle. Silence. The cattle slowly entered the ring. They looked nothing like the massive commercial beef breeds surrounding them. Medium-sized, deep red coats with black points, wide ribs, strong feet, calm eyes, old-fashioned cattle. The auctioneer cleared his throat. This is the last registered breeding group. Still no bids. Someone in the back laughed. Nobody wants museum cows. A few ranchers smiled. Another shook his head. They grow too slow. They're too small. They're finished. Margaret Hale never took her eyes off the cattle. Nathan leaned closer. You're thinking about it. She nodded. I already decided. He looked surprised. You did? Yesterday. The auctioneer sighed. Opening bid. Margaret quietly raised her hand. The room turned. Nobody bid against her. Free taps of the gavel echoed through the sale barn. The last 13 registered Pine Ridge Heritage cattle belonged to Margaret Hale. Outside, Dale Harper caught up with her. You really bought them? I did. He looked toward the trailer where the cattle stood quietly chewing hay. You know why nobody wanted them? Margaret smiled. I know why everybody says they don't. Dale folded his arms. They finish slower. They don't get as heavy. They'll never compete with modern genetics. Margaret climbed into her truck. We'll see. The Pine Ridge Heritage breed had once covered thousands of ranches throughout the region. Long before feedlots. Long before rapid growth genetics. They had survived harsh winters. Poor pasture. Long droughts. Minimal veterinary care. But as commercial beef production evolved, producers selected larger cattle. Faster cattle. Heavier cattle. Year after year the old breed disappeared. Prospered. Sold. Forgotten. Eventually, only one conservation breeding program remained. When funding ended, the last 13 head entered the auction. Most buyers saw history ending. Margaret saw something different. When she was 14, Samuel Hale pointed toward an old photograph hanging inside the barn. The picture showed his grandfather beside several unfamiliar cattle. What breed were those? Samuel smiled. Pine Ridge. They're smaller. They lived longer. Margaret looked closer. They don't look weak. They weren't. Samuel ran one finger across the faded photograph. They raised calves on grass when bigger cattle needed grain. She frowned. So why did everyone stop raising them? Samuel looked thoughtful. Sometimes we chase efficiency until we accidentally lose resilience. That sentence stayed with her. Years later, Margaret attended a livestock genetics conference. One presentation discussed disappearing heritage breeds. Most people left before it began. Margaret stayed. The speaker explained something fascinating. Old genetics often carried traits impossible to recreate once lost. Heat tolerance, disease resistance, mothering ability, longevity, efficient forage conversion. The speaker finished with one sentence. Extinction isn't noticed until someone suddenly needs what disappeared. Margaret filled nearly an entire notebook. 3 years later, she stood inside that auction ring. The county heard immediately. Naturally. Saturday morning, the diner bust. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear what Margaret bought? Rick looked up. What now? The last Pine Ridge cattle. Several ranchers laughed. The antiques. Dale nodded. 13 head. Another rancher grinned. She's starting a history museum. More laughter. Margaret walked inside carrying fencing supplies. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He smiled. So. She laughed. So. How are the collector's items? They're settling in. You planning to charge admission? Margaret smiled. No. What then? I'm planning to breed them. The room laughed again. Nobody believed the old breed had a future. Back at the ranch, Margaret prepared differently than many expected. She didn't separate the cattle into tiny showcase pens. She turned them onto rough hill pasture. Rocky ground. Native grasses. Steep draws. Exactly the kind of country where commercial cattle often struggled. Nathan watched the herd spread naturally across the hills. They're climbing. Margaret nodded. They've always climbed. Most modern cattle preferred easier grazing. The Pine Ridge cattle actively searched rough country. Within weeks, they utilized pasture the ranch had barely touched in years. The extension grazing specialist visited in early summer. He quietly watched the herd. They're covering remarkable ground. Margaret smiled. They're harvesting grass nobody else wanted. He nodded thoughtfully. I've noticed. The first calves arrived during spring storms. Margaret checked the herd constantly. She expected difficult births. Instead, nearly every cow calved unassisted. Healthy calves stood quickly, nursed immediately. Mothers remained calm. Nathan looked amazed. We haven't pulled a single calf. Margaret smiled. Neither did Grandpa. Samuel's notebooks confirmed it. Decades earlier, he had briefly owned 4 Pine Ridge cows. Every page repeated the same observations. Excellent mothers. Never needed assistance. Raised heavy calves despite poor pasture. Samuel had sold them only because nobody wanted breeding bulls anymore. He regretted it for the rest of his life. Margaret refused to repeat that mistake. The second year brought severe drought. Pastures browned. Hay prices doubled. Commercial herds required supplemental feed much earlier than usual. Margaret watched the Pine Ridge cattle continue grazing rough hillsides. They remained in surprisingly good condition. Nathan checked body scores twice. They're holding weight. She nodded. They evolved for years exactly like this. The county veterinarian visited during pregnancy checks. He slowly worked through the herd. Healthy feet. Excellent udders. Calm dispositions. Remarkably few health problems. Finally, he smiled. I've got to admit something. Margaret looked over. What? I expected much worse. Instead, the old cattle looked quietly impressive. Not flashy. Not oversized. Simply functional. The veterinarian pointed toward an older cow. How old is she? Margaret checked her records. Almost 14. He looked surprised. Still raising calves? Every year. He laughed softly. Many commercial cows retire years before that. Word spread quietly. Not excitement. Curiosity. A few ranchers stopped by, mostly to look. Some still laughed. Others simply asked questions. One producer watched the cattle graze cedar-covered hills. They don't seem interested in the easy pasture. Margaret smiled. They've already eaten it. The producer laughed. I've never seen cows work this hard. They don't think they're working. Autumn brought the first group of weaned calves. They weren't the heaviest calves sold that week. Not even close. Several buyers walked past them. Then one grass-finished beef producer stopped. He studied the calves carefully, then asked, "What breed?" Margaret answered, "Pine Ridge Heritage." He smiled. "I've been looking for cattle exactly like these." Nathan looked surprised. After the buyer left, he asked, "You knew?" Margaret nodded. "I suspected." "What?" Someone would eventually remember why they existed. Over the next 2 years, interest remained modest but steady. Small grass-fed producers, conservation ranches, university livestock programs. Nobody wanted hundreds of cattle. They wanted genetics. The herd slowly expanded. 13 became 22. 22 became 36. Margaret sold almost no breeding females. Only carefully selected young bulls. Samuel had written one warning in bold letters decades earlier. Never rebuild a rare herd by selling its future. Margaret followed that advice exactly. Late one autumn afternoon, a convoy of pickup trucks rolled onto the ranch. Out stepped livestock geneticists from the state university, representatives from the State Beef Association, and the director of the Livestock Conservation Board. They quietly watched the Pine Ridge herd grazing rough hillsides with newborn calves at their sides. The conservation director slowly lowered his binoculars, then turned toward Margaret. He smiled. "I've got a question." Margaret folded her arms. "Go ahead." He looked across the growing herd. "Do you realize you may now own the largest remaining pure Pine Ridge breeding herd anywhere in the country?" The conservation director slowly lowered his binoculars. He looked across the hillside where the red cattle grazed native grass as calmly as if nothing about them was unusual. Then he turned to Margaret. "Do you realize you may now own the largest remaining pure Pine Ridge breeding herd anywhere in the country?" Margaret glanced toward the oldest cows. "I knew we'd rebuilt the herd." The director smiled. "You've done much more than that." Nathan looked surprised. "What do you mean?" The director opened a folder. "Our records show every remaining registered animal." He paused. "After your calves this spring." He smiled. "Nearly 70% of the breed now traces directly to this ranch." Silence settled over the pasture. Margaret hadn't been trying to own the breed. She had simply refused to let it disappear. The news spread through the livestock industry faster than anyone expected. Agricultural magazines published stories. University genetics departments requested visits. Breed conservation organizations called almost daily. Yet the biggest surprise came from commercial ranchers. The same people who had laughed at the auction. One by one they started showing up. Not to criticize, to ask questions. The first arrived during another difficult summer. Hay prices had climbed again. Pastures struggled. Large-framed cattle required expensive supplemental feed. Meanwhile, the Pine Ridge herd quietly grazed steep hillsides covered with native grasses. Nathan checked body condition scores. They've barely changed. Margaret nodded. They're doing what they've always done. Dale Harper drove through the gate, carrying nothing but a notebook. He watched the herd for nearly half an hour. Finally, he asked, "How many hay bales did they eat last winter?" Margaret answered honestly, "About 40% less than our commercial herd." Dale blinked. "You're serious?" "I keep records." She handed him one of Samuel's old notebooks beside her own. Every winter, every calving season, every pasture rotation, everything documented. Dale slowly closed the book. "I laughed at these cattle." "You did. I thought smaller meant worse." Margaret smiled. "It sometimes means different." The following autumn, the state university began a 5-year research project. Not on meat production, on resilience. Researchers compared commercial cattle and Pine Ridge cattle during heat waves, drought, and rough grazing conditions. The results surprised nearly everyone. The Pine Ridge cows traveled farther each day, required fewer veterinary treatments, maintained better fertility during drought, stayed productive years longer. Even their calves required remarkably little intervention. The lead researcher smiled after reviewing the first year's data. "You know what's unusual?" Margaret looked over. "What?" "They aren't exceptional in one category." He looked back toward the herd. "They're consistently good at almost everything." She laughed softly. That's how Grandpa described them. The research attracted attention far beyond the state. Grass-fed beef producers wanted breeding bulls. Mountain ranches wanted hardy replacement females. Conservation grazing programs requested entire breeding groups. Margaret declined most offers. Nathan looked over another stack of purchase requests. "You could sell every animal twice." Margaret nodded. "That's exactly why we won't." He smiled. "I know. Samuel's rule." She laughed. "Never sell tomorrow." Instead of selling large numbers of cattle, Margaret built a structured breeding program. Young bulls underwent careful evaluation. Only the strongest genetics left the ranch. Every breeding female stayed until herd numbers became secure. Growth remained steady instead of explosive. The conservation director returned 2 years later. This time he wasn't alone. Representatives from several western states followed him through the pastures. One rancher from Wyoming watched an old Pine Ridge cow nursing a healthy calf at 16 years of age. He stopped walking. "She's 16?" Margaret nodded. "Still raising one every spring." He shook his head. "My commercial cows rarely stay that long." Nearby, another visitor examined the cattle's feet. No trimming. No. Minimal hoof problems. Margaret smiled. They've been walking rocky country for generations. The visitors kept asking the same question. Why did everyone stop raising them? Margaret answered differently every time. Markets changed. Feedlots changed. People chased different traits. None of those answers were wrong. None told the whole story. The truth was simpler. People had forgotten what the breed had been created to do. One unusually harsh winter reminded everyone. A series of ice storms swept across the valley. Temperatures stayed below freezing for nearly 3 weeks. Commercial cattle required constant supplemental feeding. Many producers struggled to keep equipment moving through snow. Margaret watched the Pine Ridge herd. They broke through light snow to reach dormant grasses, sheltered naturally among cedar ridges, protected calves with remarkable instinct. Losses remained almost non-existent. After the storm ended, Dale stopped by. He leaned against the fence watching the herd. "You know what finally convinced me?" Margaret smiled. "What?" They never panicked. She looked toward the cattle. "They've seen winters like this before." He laughed. "Not these cattle." "No." She smiled. "But their ancestors did." The research program concluded 5 years after it began. The final report drew national attention. It didn't claim the Pine Ridge breed produced the biggest cattle, or the fastest. Instead, it reached a different conclusion. One of the most resilient heritage cattle breeds ever documented under modern ranch conditions. Suddenly, waiting lists formed. Breeding bulls sold years before they were born. Universities established conservation partnerships. Young ranchers began rebuilding purebred herds across the region. The breed everyone had dismissed quietly returned. One spring morning, the state fair invited Margaret to display the herd. Crowds gathered around the Pine Ridge cattle. Children petted gentle calves. Older ranchers stood silently reading the breed history displayed beside them. One elderly man removed his hat. "My grandfather raised cattle that looked exactly like these." Margaret smiled. "He probably knew something we forgot." Late that afternoon, the auctioneer from the original sale found her beside the pens. He laughed softly. "I've been thinking about that auction." Margaret smiled. "So have I." He looked at the calm herd. "I almost skipped that lot." You did. I thought nobody cared. She looked across the cattle. I cared. He shook his head. No. You cared before everyone else remembered. That evening, after the crowds had gone home, Margaret stood alone beside the oldest cow in the herd. The cow lowered her head and quietly nudged her shoulder. Margaret remembered the laughter echoing through the sale barn years earlier. People had seen 13 outdated cattle. They saw slow growth, smaller frames, old genetics, an ending. Margaret saw generations of adaptation that could never be recreated once lost. She wasn't trying to preserve the past. She was protecting options for the future. By the time ranchers across the state began rebuilding Pine Ridge herds, very few remembered the afternoon those last 13 cattle entered the auction ring with no bidders waiting. Margaret remembered every moment, because every healthy calf now grazing ranches across the region traced back to 13 quiet cattle that everyone else believed had already become history. Sometimes the greatest fortune isn't measured by how much an animal weighs. Sometimes it's measured by how much irreplaceable history still walks beside it.